Welcome to our deep dive. We'll be exploring Brené Brown's Daring Greatly.
And we're using the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu to help us navigate.
It's like having a personal expert giving us all the key insights.
Exactly.
Think of it as a shortcut.
Yes, a shortcut to understanding.
Brown's powerful message.
Especially for those of you interested in leadership.
Entrepreneurship.
Or even just self-improvement.
We're going to uncover some pretty interesting stuff today.
Oh, definitely.
Like, did you know there's a link between vulnerability and strength?
We'll be talking about that.
And the dangers of scarcity culture.
That feeling of never enough.
Even joy can be scary sometimes, according to Brené Brown.
We'll delve into all of that and more today.
So to kick things off, let's give a quick overview of Daring Greatly.
Okay, so first things first.
The 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu.
Yes, that's our guide for this deep dive.
It's a fantastic resource for anyone looking for business insights.
Absolutely.
And in this guide, it boils down Daring Greatly.
Into an easy-to-understand format.
Perfect for busy folks who want to get to the heart of the matter.
Exactly.
Now, the core message of Daring Greatly
is that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness.
I know, right? It's kind of counterintuitive.
It is.
But Brown makes a really compelling case.
She does.
And she backs it up with research, not just anecdotes.
Oh, but there are plenty of those too.
Which makes it so much more relatable, you know?
Absolutely.
Speaking of anecdotes,
right, yes.
There's a great example about Howard Schultz.
The former CEO of Starbucks.
Yes. When Starbucks was struggling,
And lost their way a bit.
Schultz did something radical.
He shut down all U.S. stores.
For an entire afternoon.
Can you imagine?
To retrain the baristas.
And he publicly admitted to shareholders
that they had made mistakes.
It was a huge risk.
But it showed incredible commitment to quality.
And a willingness to be vulnerable.
And guess what?
It worked.
It totally worked. Starbucks came back stronger than ever.
It's a great example of the power of vulnerability.
Right. It's about being honest, even when it's tough.
And taking action to correct course.
So, the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu breaks down Daring Greatly
into 5 major takeaways.
The first, and arguably the most important,
is that vulnerability is not weakness.
We'll definitely be talking more about that later.
Yes, we'll unpack that one for sure.
The second big idea is scarcity culture.
It's that feeling of never having enough.
Always chasing something.
Whether it's time, love, or success.
I think a lot of our listeners can relate to that.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a constant state of lack.
And it can be incredibly draining.
The 1-hour guide really emphasizes how this can be a trap.
A trap that leads to burnout, anxiety, and all sorts of problems.
So the third takeaway
is wholehearted living,
which Brown describes as a way of living with intention and purpose.
And she outlines 10 guideposts for achieving this.
It sounds like a roadmap to a more fulfilling life.
It really is.
Okay, what about the last 2 takeaways?
Number 4 focuses on vulnerability in leadership.
So a leader who is open and authentic,
exactly,
that creates trust, encourages risk-taking,
leads to innovation,
and ultimately drives growth.
It's a win-win.
And finally, there's building shame resilience.
Shame is such a powerful emotion.
It can really hold us back.
In so many ways.
But the good news is,
the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu dives deep into shame and fear,
giving us a framework for understanding them.
And how to spot them in ourselves and others.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Let's do it.
What exactly are shame and fear, according to the guide?
Well, shame is that feeling of, I am not enough.
That deep-seated feeling of inadequacy.
Exactly.
While fear is more of a response to a perceived threat.
A survival mechanism.
So they're both uncomfortable emotions.
But they come from different places.
Shame attacks our self-worth.
While fear is about protecting us from danger.
I think we've all felt the I am not enough feeling at some point.
Oh, definitely. It's a universal human experience.
But is it really that powerful?
Oh, yes.
Powerful enough to trigger a fight-or-flight response?
It can, actually.
Right.
The 1-hour guide breaks it down into 3 stages.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The first stage is that our belief of, I am not enough.
It gets interpreted as a threat.
A threat to our sense of belonging.
Identity, even safety.
It goes deep, right.
Wow, so it's not just feeling a bit down.
It's our brains perceiving danger.
It's like our ancient wiring kicking in.
Exactly. Think about our ancestors.
Being part of a group meant survival.
Rejection could mean death.
So feeling inadequate.
It triggers that primal fear of being ostracized.
It's amazing how our brains still react that way.
Even though our world is so different.
Okay, so the brain sees not enough as a threat.
And that triggers the second stage,
Which is?
the fight, flight, or freeze response.
Oh, right.
And this isn't just about physical danger.
It's about how we react in all sorts of situations.
Exactly.
So fight could be getting defensive in a meeting.
when your ideas are challenged.
Flight could be avoiding situations where you might not measure up.
And freeze would be feeling paralyzed by shame, unable to act.
It all makes sense now.
And here's the thing.
What's that?
This whole I am not enough belief,
It can trap us in a vicious cycle,
we react to shame with fight, flight, or freeze,
which only reinforces the original belief.
making us feel even more inadequate.
It's like a negative feedback loop.
Exactly.
So how do we break free from that?
Well, the first step is recognizing when shame is at play.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the 1-hour guide outlines some behaviors that signal shame.
Oh, I'm definitely curious about those.
Like what?
What are some of the signs that shame is driving our actions?
One common sign is withdrawal.
Social isolation.
It's more than just being introverted.
It's actively pulling away from others.
because of shame.
Think about that friend who always cancels plans last minute.
Or the colleague who avoids social gatherings.
There's a good chance shame is at work there. That's a good point. It's easy to misinterpret those behaviors,
As flakiness or introversion.
but there might be a deeper struggle going on.
Another sign is perfectionism.
Ah, yes. But isn't striving for excellence a good thing?
It can be.
But perfectionism is different.
It's about trying to appear flawless.
To avoid shame.
It's driven by fear.
Fear of judgment, failure, not being good enough.
Exactly.
So someone who obsesses over every detail,
Terrified of criticism.
they might actually be battling shame.
It's a defense mechanism.
And then there's people-pleasing.
Ah, yes. The constant need to please others.
Even at your own expense.
Saying yes when you're exhausted.
That's often shame talking, too.
It comes from a fear of disapproval,
We often associate people-pleasing with kindness.
but it can be rooted in fear.
Fear of not being accepted or loved.
And let's not forget about aggression.
And defensiveness.
Lashing out at the smallest criticism.
Being overly argumentative.
It could be a way of shielding oneself from feeling inadequate.
So, the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu is saying that these behaviors,
There are attempts to cope with shame,
that they often backfire.
making things worse in the long run.
It's like wearing heavy armor.
That weighs us down instead of protecting us.
That's a great analogy.
And speaking of armor,
This leads us to another interesting concept,
the vulnerability armory.
which we'll explore next time.
I'm looking forward to it.
But before we move on,
Yes.
what are your thoughts on what we've learned so far?
About shame and fear.
Yes. Have you recognized any of these behaviors?
In yourself or others.
It's definitely food for thought.
It is. Yeah, it's really interesting how Brené Brown uses this idea of a vulnerability armory.
Like we're all knights preparing for battle,
Right. But the battle is against vulnerability,
and we put on this armor,
thinking it will protect us.
but it actually ends up holding us back.
Exactly.
So the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu talks about 3 main types of armor.
Foreboding joy, perfectionism, and numbing.
Let's start with foreboding joy.
Okay.
What is that exactly?
Well, have you ever felt that?
Like when something great happens?
You get a sense of dread.
Yeah, like it's too good to be true.
Exactly. You start worrying that it won't last.
Or that something bad's going to happen.
You're almost afraid to be happy.
Because you're anticipating disappointment.
It's like we can't just enjoy the moment.
Oh, I totally relate to that.
It happens in relationships too.
You meet someone amazing.
But instead of being excited,
You start thinking about all the ways it could go wrong.
we sabotage our own happiness.
It's crazy.
It is.
So how do we deal with this?
Brené Brown suggests gratitude
Okay.
instead of focusing on what might happen.
We shift our attention to what we have now. Appreciating the present moment.
Being grateful for the good things.
Makes sense.
It's about savoring the experience.
Okay, what about perfectionism?
We talked about it briefly before.
But the guide dives deeper.
Into how it's a form of armor.
Right.
Remember, perfectionism isn't about striving for excellence.
It's about avoiding shame.
Creating an illusion of flawlessness.
It's all about fear.
Fear of judgment, failure, not being good enough.
I can see how that plays out in the workplace.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine a leader who is a perfectionist.
They might micromanage their team,
Be afraid to delegate.
set unrealistic standards,
They're so focused on avoiding mistakes.
that they miss out on opportunities.
For growth and innovation.
And the worst part,
What's that?
perfectionism is a never-ending cycle.
You're never good enough.
There's always something more to achieve.
Another standard to meet.
It's exhausting.
So how do we escape this perfectionism trap?
Self-compassion,
All right.
treating ourselves with kindness,
Like we would treat a friend,
accepting that we're imperfect.
that we all make mistakes. That's easier said than done,
It is.
but it's essential for breaking free from perfectionism.
Okay, let's talk about the third type of armor.
Numbing,
This one can be tough to face.
because it's about avoiding discomfort.
At all costs.
We try to build a wall.
Between ourselves and our feelings.
We don't want to feel anything too intensely.
Whether it's joy, sadness, or anything in between.
And there are so many ways to numb ourselves.
Workaholism.
Binge watching.
Excessive shopping.
Anything that distracts us.
From being present with our emotions.
In the workplace, it might look like emotional detachment.
Avoiding conflict.
Not having those tough conversations.
Staying busy to avoid facing emotions.
It's like running away from vulnerability.
Both our own and our team's.
And that's not healthy in the long run.
It's not.
So what's the antidote to numbing?
The 1-Hour Guide suggests developing healthier coping mechanisms.
Like setting boundaries.
Practicing mindfulness.
Engaging in activities that bring us joy.
It's about learning to be with our emotions.
Not running from them.
Now let's connect all of this to leadership.
The 1-Hour Guide says that vulnerability in leadership is a superpower.
It's not a weakness,
It's a bold statement.
but it's true
Why is vulnerability so crucial for leaders?
because it builds trust.
It creates authenticity.
Leaders who are willing to be vulnerable,
They inspire their teams
to be courageous,
to be empathetic.
to be resilient.
It sets the tone for the entire organization.
So how do leaders create a culture of vulnerability?
What does the 1-Hour Guide suggest?
It starts with modeling vulnerability themselves.
Okay, so leading by example,
Being willing to admit when they don't know something.
sharing their struggles and mistakes,
Showing their human side.
not trying to appear perfect.
Exactly.
That takes courage,
It does.
but it's so powerful.
Leaders also need to create safe spaces.
Where vulnerability is encouraged,
This means open communication,
constructive feedback.
celebrating learning from mistakes,
It's about fostering an environment
where people feel comfortable taking risks
and being themselves.
without fear of judgment.
Now, the 1-Hour Guide by Anil Nathu talks about the disengagement divide.
The gap between our values and our actions,
We might say one thing,
but do another.
and this is especially problematic in the workplace,
When leaders talk about integrity and transparency,
but their actions don't align,
it creates distrust.
and disengagement among employees.
They see right through it.
So how do we bridge this gap?
The 1-Hour Guide suggests being more intentional.
About aligning our actions with our values,
We need to define our core values.
and make sure our behavior reflects those values. It's about walking the walk
not just talking the talk
and being accountable.
when we fall short.
The 1-Hour Guide also emphasizes empathy,
Trying to understand other people's perspectives.
seeing the world through their eyes,
This creates a more inclusive environment,
where people feel understood and valued.
and that leads to greater engagement.
Now the guide takes this idea of engagement even further.
With the concept of disruptive engagement,
That sounds intriguing.
it's about challenging the norms.
That create disconnection in the workplace.
And in education,
It's a more human-centered approach.
prioritizing connection and empathy
It's a pretty radical shift.
from the traditional top-down approach.
So how do we put this into practice?
The 1-Hour Guide gives some examples.
Like what?
One example is a school that encouraged vulnerability among teachers.
And that led to greater collaboration and innovation,
Another example is a tech company that prioritized trust.
leading to higher engagement and creativity. These examples show the power of connection.
It's not just about productivity.
It's about creating a more fulfilling experience for everyone.
Recognizing the value of each individual.
Okay, the guide also talks about wholehearted parenting.
Applying these principles to raising children.
So instead of trying to create perfect little achievers,
We focus on nurturing their emotional intelligence.
their resilience, their ability to connect,
We create a space where they feel safe to be themselves
to express their emotions, to make mistakes.
and to learn from those experiences,
It's about fostering intrinsic self-worth.
not tying their worth to their achievements.
Wholehearted parenting is about raising a generation
Of empathetic, courageous individuals.
who will go on to make a positive impact on the world.
That's the goal.
And finally, Daring Greatly talks about the wholehearted revolution.
What does that even mean?
So it's like a movement towards a better world.
A more compassionate
A
world.
world where we're not afraid to be vulnerable.
Where connection is valued.
And the 1-Hour Guide by Anil Nathu says it starts with us.
Each and every one of us.
So how do we become part of this revolution?
Well, it starts with personal responsibility,
Oh.
being mindful of our thoughts and actions.
And how they affect others.
We need to recognize our own patterns of shame and fear
And choose to act with courage.
and empathy.
It's also about challenging the norms.
The beliefs that perpetuate shame and disconnection.
So speaking up against injustice.
Yes.
Having those difficult conversations about vulnerability.
Even when it feels uncomfortable.
Choosing courage over comfort.
Connection over isolation.
The guide also talks about the importance of community.
Building communities that support wholehearted living,
Creating spaces where vulnerability is embraced.
where people feel safe to be themselves.
I love that.
Me too.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have
We explored the myth of vulnerability as weakness.
the power of wholehearted living,
The importance of shame resilience.
and how these ideas apply to our personal lives.
Our work, our leadership, and how we parent.
The 1 Hour Guide has given us a fantastic overview of daring greatly.
But remember,
It's just a starting point
it's designed to spark your curiosity.
and inspire you to dive deeper.
So if you're feeling inspired,
And want to learn more?
we highly recommend checking out the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu website
You'll find tons of practical advice.
and thought-provoking insights
And of course, we encourage you to read Daring Greatly.
to get the full experience.
Pick a book that can truly change your life.
As we wrap up our deep dive today,
We want to leave you with a question.
okay, what is it?
Think about a time you felt shame at work
Maybe after making a mistake.
or receiving criticism,
How could you have navigated that situation differently?
using Brené Brown's advice.
That's a great question.
Or consider one small act of vulnerability you could do today.
What would that look like for you?
Maybe admitting you don't know something.
Or sharing a struggle with a trusted friend.
Remember, vulnerability is not the opposite of courage.
It's the path to courage
It's the key to connection.
and a more fulfilling life.
Thank you for joining us today.
Visit the 1 Hour Guide website for more business insights by Anil Nathu.